I will try my best to keep an eye on the chat, but I will also invite this to be interactive because it's much more interesting to have a dialogue and a conversation around this. So thank you for taking your time to spend with me today. And I look forward to learning from you as we have a dialogue as we go through. So as I started to think about this, someone posed the question to me. They said, if your child came to you, or if your niece or nephew came to you and said, what's your advice? What are some of the lessons that you've learned that you would pass on? And I'll throw it out to people and you can pop it in the chat or just speak up. What would be some of those life lessons that you would want to share with people? Don't be shy. Come on, ladies, you've all learned things.
I think, Erin, I'll jump in. I think one life lesson that I've learned is cut yourself slack and be gentle with yourself.
That's a great one.
And I say that as somebody who has been kind of high achieving and very perfectionist in my tendencies over the years. And for many years, I thought those things were strengths, but as I've gotten older, I've realized they can work against you.
Yep, no, that's a great one. Anybody else?
One thing that I've learned is to try and always stay positive, even if others are around you are upset about something, in a bad mood. Just try and keep your own positivity, because that will carry you throughout your day, your weeks, your year. So
that's a great one too. My father, anybody who knows me, my dad was an optimist, and he would always look at me and go, Erin, remember, our glass is half full. So I think those are great ones. Anybody else? All right. So as I started to think about this, here were some of the sort of 6 lessons from life and work that occurred to me. And as you sort of glance through these, you'll probably say, yeah, I agree with all those. There's not necessarily anything profound or earth-shattering. And I think sometimes the simplest things are the ones that, when we take a step back and when you talk about, Jen, about being positive, it's a simple thought, but it's really profound. But what I want to share with all of you is a bit about my journey and how I experienced and learned from each of these. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a mother of 1. I have an 7-year-old, little boy who today's his last day of school. So we're going to have a 2nd grader very soon. I've worked for 2 companies in my career, but with those 2 companies, I've lived in 5 countries. I've been in the workforce 24 plus years, and I have visited or done business in 54 countries. So I've had a broad spectrum of experiences that has really formed all of these lessons and how I approach the way that I work and how I approach a lot of my interactions. And so what I wanted to do today and the next, 20 minutes or so is share some of those and share those with you. And I welcome your insights and how you relate to them as well. So we'll jump into it. My first job was actually in Paris, France. I was 23 years old and got on a plane. And this was in the day when you could actually walk people to the gate and see people off, which I know is just a foreign concept these days. And I got on a plane and flew to France with my college French, not knowing anybody, and knowing that I had a job and that somebody was going to help me get a hotel room so I could eventually find a place to live. Everything worked out, but about 6 months into my job, I was on the phone with my dad and I said, Daddy, I don't talk. And he goes, what? He said, I find that really hard to believe, because remember, I was working with all French people. And what I realized was that I wasn't speaking a lot because I knew that the 7-year-old could potentially sound more intelligent than I did. And it was a moment of saying, but if I ever want to connect with these people, if I ever really want to become a part of this culture and really learn more about it and be a part of it, I'm going to have to humble myself. I'm going to have to humble myself, sound a little foolish for a while, but I'm going to grow from that. And so I was really proud of myself that at the end of my about 2 years that I lived in Paris, I was corrected a lot, but my accent grew better, my interactions grew better. And by the end, I was able to have conversations and ask questions across a broad spectrum of topics. And I really felt very much more connected to the people. And I had a differentiated experience because I took that moment to realize, okay, you got to take a chance. You got to be ready to sound a little foolish. But what I found was that everybody was willing to help. And people were really happy to meet me halfway. And I'll never forget, I had a store clerk once who said to me, she corrected me, and then she said, I'm going to keep speaking in French to you because you're trying. And she was really appreciative that I had made that effort to do that. So it was around really, how do I humble myself and really learn from that so that I can connect? Following my time in Paris, I moved back to the US. I moved to New York. So that's a view of downtown Manhattan with the Brooklyn Bridge. And I went to work on Wall Street. And I was a woman in her mid-20s, looked young, and was working with large firms on Wall Street. For anybody who's been around the IT world, I was working on the mainframe. Now, the mainframe first came out from IBM in 1964. Needless to say, that's before I was born. And I found myself working with men who had been living, working on this platform for, in some cases, longer than I had been alive. They were my dad's age. And I thought, I realized pretty quickly, I'm never going to know as much as they do because they've been doing this for, 20, 30 years in some cases. But how can I bring value to them? And I can't walk in and try to convince them that I know more. And what I really learned was that the value I could provide was to support my customers so that they could be great. So, my being humble and learning from them meant that I wasn't going to be intimidated by their tenure because I had a value to bring. I had a role that I could play. And I think that's carried through as I look at a lot of my interactions now. I lead a very senior team of very technical folks here at Google, many of them who have helped to shape some of the technologies in the industry. And my role is to be their leader, not to necessarily be a subject matter expert, because they're having conversations day to day on one set of topics. I'm having a different set of conversations, but it's how do I provide value and lead them so that they can bring value back to others. So it's not being intimidated by their knowledge and really saying, how do I learn from them and learn with them as they go through this journey? I've had a unique opportunity to go to India a number of times in my career. And if you've never been to India, I highly recommend it. It is a beautiful country. It is a beautiful culture. I had an experience where I was working on a project where my peer that I was working with was an Australian male. And we had an individual come in with his team to present to us. And the team lead sat across from my peer and me and began to interact with us, and we were having a very fascinating conversation around culture and adaptability across India. And out of the corner of my eye, I could see his employee struggling to connect her laptop to the projector. And my Western inclination and my technical and want to help background said, you should get up and you should help her. That's what you should do, Erin. But what I observed was that the man who was my primary audience, he didn't move. He continued to speak with my peer and me, and we continue to have our conversation. And my peer and I talked about it afterwards because both of us shared that Western inclination to help. But what we learned was to be respectful of the culture and to be respectful of that. And how do I adapt? Because in the end, as I've seen, as I've worked around the world, I need to be respectful of the culture, understand it and appreciate it to figure out how do I achieve my goals within that culture. And I've even seen that as I've changed jobs and changed roles. How do I understand the culture, respect it, and adapt myself to be successful within that? And I think a lot of us have seen that even in terms of our personal interworkings. For anybody who's been in a family dynamic, you realize there are times where you need to adapt to the new family dynamic, potentially with your in-laws. And then there are other times where you need to say, okay, I'm going to keep quiet or I'm going to speak up. But that was a very interesting experience around adapting to the culture in order to be successful and work within that. Following some time in India, I was in my boss's office, and it was one of the best bosses I've ever had. And he and I were having a wonderful discussion with work. And at the end of the meeting, he turned to me and he said, "Erin, what do you want to do next? Where do you want to go from here?" And I said to him without thinking, I said, "I would really love to go and work in the growth markets." And at that period of time, working in the growth markets meant moving to China. And I walked out of his office and I had that moment of, what the heck did you just say? You've never been to China. And I thought, well, that was my gut reaction. So that was probably the right one. And now you fast forward about 2 months later, and my boss calls me and says, "Congratulations, you're being promoted and we're going to send you to China." And a couple things in my personal life that were happening at that point. I had just started to date a wonderful man who is now my husband, but he had no plans to move to China. I'll never forget, I called my mother and said, "Hey, what would you think if I went to China?" She said, "That's far." My older sister, when I called her and said, "I got this new job, I'm going to go to China. What do you think?" She said, "Well, don't expect me to come visit you." So I had some headwinds that were blowing at me. And, I love my family, but they were not the most adventurous at the time. But my gut said, this is the right thing for you as a person and as a professional to take this chance and move to China. And so I did. I moved to China. The man I was dating moved to China with me and we got married, which was wonderful. But it was a unique experience. And I learned there are so many wonderful ideas. My team in China was wonderfully creative with some of the things that they could do, because they had to be in some ways, because they were not as close to the headquarters of the company. So they had to figure out how to do things. And I got the unique opportunity to build, grow a team, and really understand different ways of working and really embracing and experiencing that in that environment. After China, we moved to Prague in the Czech Republic. And my son was actually born while I was on assignment in Prague. And for you ladies that are here, I'll share 2 stories about this. The first was that I had to find an OBGYN. Now, all of the Western expats that I worked with were men. And the women in my office were primarily Czech, and I obviously needed an OB who spoke English and who spoke good English because my Czech was really non-existent. So I had to turn to one of the men one day and said, I knew that he had a child who had been born in the Czech Republic, and I had to turn to him and say, "Hey, I have a question for your wife. Can you please connect me with your wife so that I can ask her this question?" Which he did. And my son was born, happy, healthy little boy, born in a Czech hospital with only my doctor who spoke English and all the nurses spoke Czech. So we got to experience that. But in Eastern Europe and in a lot of European countries, women will take off for a month before the child is born, and then they'll take like 18 months off after the baby's born. So on my American contract, when I showed back up to work 7 weeks later, still as a mother who was breastfeeding her son, I was really an anomaly in my office. And I still had to travel. And on one particular trip, I was going to Kazakhstan. And I was traveling with one of my employees and a peer of mine. And I thought, I need to explain to these two men that I'm going to have to disappear from time to time to go express breast milk, which is, I will say, I know that in American offices, you generally have a dedicated room for this and all kinds of things that really didn't exist because women didn't do this in the office. And so I had to have the conversation with both of them around the idea of, okay, this is what I'm going to have to do. I'm going to have to step away. And I also had to have the discussion with our host in Kazakhstan around the fact that I'm going to have to step away. I'm going to have to step out of the office. I'm going to have to step out of the meetings and go express breast milk. And it was knowing that that was something that I needed. It was something that was natural, and not being ashamed to go and have that conversation. I'll tell you, when I shared it with my two peers, they both said, oh yeah, I remember when my wife was doing that with our children. Here's how she experienced it. And although, yes, I ended up standing in a ladies' bathroom 2 floors up from where the meeting was, it was something that I thought, this is something I need to do. This is part of who I am. It was interesting. I've also read articles and books about it recently, about women just stepping up and saying, hey, I need a parking space that's closer to the building. And I think sometimes we look at it as, I'm asking for special treatment, but no, you're really not. It's just not being ashamed to go ahead and ask for that, because you do have that, that right and that ability. So the last place I want to tell you a little bit about was when I moved to Dubai. Dubai in the UAE was a fascinating place to live. We lived there for roughly 2 years. And the office where I worked there was really a mixture of cultures, many Middle Eastern, but then a lot of Europeans as well. And I had numerous times in my career where I had been sized up, be it on Wall Street. I was even sized up once at a Yankees game where 2 guys looked at me, sized me up, and decided that I didn't understand what I was talking about technically. And I learned throughout my career not to really let that bother me. But there was a particular occasion where my boss had asked me to fill in and cover a meeting for him. I had just recently been promoted to a vice president. And as people started to gather in my boss's office, I made the choice to go and sit in his chair. I thought, I am the most senior person in this room. He has asked me to cover this and lead this meeting for him, and I'm going to go take his seat. And it was asserting to some of the folks in the room, and asserting culturally that this was my value, that I had a right to sit in this chair, and that I was not apologetically sitting in it. I made a conscious choice to go and take his seat and say, here's where I'm going to be, and here's where I'm going to sit. And it was interesting to watch the dynamic of the room as people looked at that and respected me for taking that seat. So this kind of brings me to where I am today. This is my 6-year-old wearing my Noogler cap from Google. When you join Google, you are called a Noogler. So my son proudly wears my Noogler cap around. But I mean, as I think about this, it's a couple things that I've learned. Like I said, it's knowing your value, knowing who you are, and knowing that you have a right to be there and to be a part of that discussion. Don't be afraid to take a risk. Don't be afraid to move to France at 24, or even, you fast forward 15 years later when I moved to China, not really knowing what I was going to do or necessarily where I was going to live, but knowing that there's something that I can bring to that and something that I can gain from it. And thinking to be humble, but you're supposed to be there. And there's a reason that you're there and you do have something to give to that, be it the meeting, the team, the environment, you do have value. And I think one of my last thoughts that I'll leave you with is that as I've traveled the world, what I've really seen is that, at the end of the day, people are people. And the people you encounter, most of them are just trying to work with their families, put food on the table and take care of their children. And I think it's when you take that back to that human experience for yourself that you're able to connect and adapt and work with the various people.
Thank you, Erin. So we only have a couple minutes left, but I'd love to give people an opportunity if there's a question or two that we can, with some haste, touch upon before we have to go on to the main event at noon. Feel free to unmute and just jump on in.
Or you can just look at the silly picture of my son.
Yes.
Hey, Erin, I'll share something with you that really resonated with me. Your messaging around asking for what you need, I think is really valuable. And it's something that I learned, probably somewhat recently in my career, and have been, coaching, those I manage on, and the occasional peer on, just being open and vulnerable and being willing to ask for what you need, and then trying to practice that myself when I need it in my own life. And what I've learned is most of the time, it just opens the door to, being able to have more joy and more peace, and minimizing stress. So I really want to thank you for sharing that.
No, thank you for sharing that. The other quick story that I'll say about knowing what you need is, I think especially with COVID, with all of us being at home, I'll share that I took a day in the winter and I went sledding with my son in the afternoon. He had finished school. He had been begging me, "Mommy, go sledding with me. Mommy, go sledding with me." And did I have work to do? Yes. But what he needed and what I needed in that moment was to go sledding. And it's funny, like you said, Jan, when I told my boss what I had done, she thought it was marvelous. She was like, "Good for you. You really need to take that page," and wanting to encourage others to take that time. So I think it's a great message that it is being a little vulnerable, but allowing yourself to be vulnerable, because on the other side, there's a lot that you can gain from it.
And you can only go sledding with your 6-year-old for a short time in life. Don't miss it. Well, we are at 7 of, and I want to give everybody a chance to do whatever you need to do before logging into the noon meeting. Thank you so much, Ms. Williams.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
I think that was wonderful. I hope everybody enjoyed that. I've put in the chat box the link to the main meeting, so please feel free to tap on that when at 12 o'clock, and you'll be able to jump on over. And till then, have a wonderful rest of your day, all of you.